All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to APUSH. Sorry we can't be in the same room this week, but got to stay away from that coronavirus. All right, let's do it. World War II. I'm excited. I sure hope you are. First things first, let's just remember that many would say World War II starts in 1931 when Japan invades Manchuria. Even in the early 1930s, the Japanese realized that that the clock was ticking on their ability to fuel their economy with natural resources. Japan is a beautiful place, but it is poor in natural resources. This was a time, I mean, much like today, where you needed a lot of fuel, you needed a lot of natural resources, iron, steel, you need oil. You need to be able to refine that oil into fuel oil and gasoline. You need all these things, rubber, in order to have a large military. And in order to keep your economy going, Japan realizes at this point in history they don't have enough. And so they decide to go out and take it. This, of course, was a massive violation of international law at the time, the fact that Japan just invades Manchuria. But the League of Nations is weak. The United States, as you know, stayed out of the league. And the great powers of the world aren't aren't in any position to respond to this. One, because they're still disillusioned from World War One. They don't want any more war. And two, the Great Depression has started. So they're not even in a position to respond to this. So many would say World War II really starts here in 1931, though the traditional date is going to be September 1939. During the 20s, fascism starts to rise in Europe. You're going to have a series of strong men, namely Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, taking advantage of the turmoil left in the wake of World War I, and they're going to take over these governments. Benito Mussolini is going to seize power in Italy in 1923. 1925, he's really established himself as Il Duce, as the leader, the dictator in Italy. We get the word fascism from Italy, from the fascisti there. And I'm just going to read this definition for you. It's a definition you need to know because this is a word that's thrown around a lot in our society. And I don't think most people really know what it means. So, fascism is a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. What does that mean? Well, let's go through these one by one. So, fascists are going to exalt the nation above the individual. This is a form of Orwellian nationalism where individuals are going to sink their identity into their country, or they're going to sink their identity into that ruling party. This really results in the loss of a lot of individual identity. The individual is downplayed for the group or the national. Let's see. Oftentimes, there's gonna be a racial element to this, like we saw in Nazi Germany, where the group in power is going to claim that their group is somehow racially superior and that all other groups need to be subordinated to that higher power, that they would say better blood. Moving on from there, government is going to be very, very centralized in a fascist nation. These are dictatorships. There's going to be strong centralized power so that that ruling regime can have a tight grip on power. And there's going to be severe economic controls. So the economy, it's not going to be owned by the government. It's not socialism. It's going to be owned by private individuals, but the government's going to control the private individuals that own the economy. So there we have it. We have the first fascist country in Italy in the 1920s. And then very soon after this, we get the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany. As you should know from the videos I had you guys watch, Hitler was a decorated soldier in World War One. He did his duty there. He was a failed art student. He was actually Austrian. And in the 20s, he's actually going to found the National Socialist Party and attempt a revolution. It's going to be a botched attempt. He's going to end up in prison for 9 months because of that. This is during the so-called Weimar Republic. And yes, if you're cool like me, you say Weimar and not Weimar because Weimar sounds much cooler. The Weimar Republic was established after World War One, and this signaled the transition in Germany from a highly structured government led by, man, what do they call him? Oh, I'm blanking right now. Anyway, um, yeah, I got to move on. But anyway, you had a move from a royal system in Germany to a democracy, but the democracy was not popular at all. And this is because these rumors start circulating right after World War One ends that Germany didn't really lose, but that its leaders sold out the Kaiser. That's what I was looking for. The Kaiser ruled Germany, World War One. But that the leaders of Germany sold out the people. The soldiers really didn't lose. So when you've got hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s, and when the Great Depression gets to Germany in the 1930s, Hitler is going to be able to rise up and say he's going to restore things to the way they are. So Hitler spends 9 months in prison. He writes Mein Kampf, where he lays out his plans. He does not hide what he wants to do to the Jewish people. He does not hide what he wants to do as far as taking territory for the Germans. Remember, the German people had lost a lot of territory after World War One. There were pockets of German people stranded in France, stranded in Czechoslovakia, and stranded in Poland that he is going to want to take back. And that's going to be the pretext he uses to start his war. But there he is in 1933. So, there was the late 20s in Germany, things got better and the hyperinflation wasn't as bad and things were looking okay. Looked like the Weimar government might survive and Germany might be a democracy. And then the Great Depression hit, and German people are starving, they're out of work, and Hitler casts himself as their savior. He's going to be able to save them from this economic turmoil and also from the national shame that came with losing World War One. From the Versailles Treaty, where Germany is forced to pay these massive reparations, which are further impoverishing the German people, and the war guilt clause, the fact that the Germans had to take guilt for World War One. Hitler is going to use this to his advantage, and he's going to create this cult of personality that is going to get the National Socialist or the Nazi Party a plurality of the votes in the early 30s. And then finally, in 1933, he's going to, the Chancellor of Germany is going to appoint him. I'm sorry, the President of Germany is going to appoint Hitler Chancellor to form a government. And from there, in 1933, Hitler's going to seize power. He's going to slowly take more and more and more control, and he's going to establish his dictatorship. And early on in the mid 1930s, the world doesn't suspect that Hitler is the monster he is yet. There are hints. Persecution against Jewish people starts to happen, especially around 1936. But the world largely ignores this because you got to remember the Great Depression is happening in America, and it's also happening in Britain and France. And those governments are worried about what's happening at home. They're not so worried about what's happening in Germany. So Hitler, as early as, certainly by 1935, he starts blatantly violating the Versailles Treaty. He increases the size of his army. He's going to send German troops back into the Rhineland, which was supposed to be demilitarized. He's going to start building the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, and he's going to start building U-boats again. The world sees this happening, and again, they don't have the stomach to do anything about it quite yet. All right, so let's look at this map. We've got aggression in Europe, 1931 to 1939. And you'll just see here, so one of the first things Hitler does is he reoccupies the Rhineland and the Saarland, which they were supposed to keep troops out of based on the Versailles Treaty. And then he's going to orchestrate a takeover in Austria, which Austria is where he's from. It's German speaking, but it was a separate sovereign nation state. And Hitler's going to just roll troops in there in 1938 and take over. And he's going to be cheered as he goes in. The big controversy is Czechoslovakia. Okay. Czechoslovakia is one of those countries that was carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I. So it was a brand new country, and there were German people living here, as you can see on my screen, in the Sudetenland. And Hitler said those people were being persecuted, that he needed to go in and protect them. And the Czechs are like, no, you are not coming in here. In fact, the Czechs had built, if you see on my map here, they had built all of these fortifications to keep the Germans out. And these were legitimate, difficult fortifications that the Germans would have had a lot of trouble getting through. And this is where Neville Chamberlain steps in. Poor Neville, just like if you want to think of the Neville and Harry Potter, okay, that is this guy, Neville Chamberlain, except he doesn't do anything amazing at the end. What he does is he is going to come down in history and be known as the great appeaser. He's going to propose appeasement. Appeasement is when you give your enemy what they want so that you don't have to go to war with them. So he orchestrates this Munich conference. And what ends up happening is they go to Munich, the great powers meet up in Munich, and Hitler says, look, if you'll just give me the Sudetenland right here, I'll be done. Just give it to me. I don't want war. I just want living space for the German people. Everything's going to be great. You can see in this picture, Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini's over here. Chamberlain falls for it. Hook, line, and sinker. Hitler is just lying, just a bold-faced lie here. And so Chamberlain gets Hitler to sign this piece of paper, the Munich Agreement, and says, look, you get the Sudetenland, no war. And he comes home and Chamberlain says, he's waving this piece of paper in the air and he says, I have secured peace in our time, which it's just going to be a very short time after this that Adolf Hitler is going to invade Poland and officially start World War II. So what happens is the Germans are given the Sudetenland. They're able to just walk right past those Czech fortifications. And then eventually the Nazis are going to take all of Czechoslovakia. After this, Britain and France say, look, Hitler, if you invade Poland, it's on. Okay, appeasement stops now. If you invade Poland, it is on. Hitler says, I don't care. I'm going to invade Poland. I don't think you guys can stop me. And look what has happened here. Man, you got to feel for the Poles in this situation. The great powers just gave the Germans this land right here. So now Poland not only has to worry about the Germans on its western border, but it has to worry about the Germans on its southern border. And I don't have the map, but the Germans had actually taken land up here as well. So when World War II actually starts in September 1939, when the Germans invade Poland, the Poles are going to be attacked from 3 fronts, and they're not really going to have a chance. So this whole episode with appeasement still really shapes how presidents and how leaders around the world respond to threats. No one wants to be known as a great appeaser. So the argument goes now, you want to attack your enemy when they're weak. So we might be able to say that this whole episode might lead to countries going to war before they normally would. But that's just a possibility. Okay. September 1939, no surprise, Hitler invades Poland. Does not go well for the Poles. The Germans have their brand new Panzer tanks, and they've got the Luftwaffe, and the Poles are outnumbered. A lot of Poles are actually going into battle on horseback, and they do have some planes, but they're very old. They have some tanks, but they're not using the tanks effectively. So it does not go well for Poland. It's mopped up in a matter of weeks, and this is going to be um, Hitler's great first big land grab of the war. Let's just pause and talk about how war has changed since World War One. So in World War One, as you should know, the advantage went to the defense because of the machine gun and because of artillery. Advantage to the defenders in World War One. Those great powers struggled for 4 years to get across no man's land, and very, very rarely were they able to do it. So one question we should ask ourselves is, why is World War II different? And the answer is simply that the technology changes. First of all, in World War I, tanks were primitive, they were slow, they were easy targets. In World War II, we've had 20 plus years of technological development now. These tanks are going to be much more heavily armored. They're going to have bigger guns. They're going to be more maneuverable, and they're going to be faster. So they're going to be able to punch through a so-called no man's land pretty quickly, and even jump trenches with those tracks on their vehicles. Another thing is the new tactics. So before the Germans adopted Blitzkrieg, the standard operating procedure would be that a general would mix in his tanks, spread all of his tanks out across a big line, and assign a tank or two, to each major infantry unit. So you had these really powerful weapons, these tanks, but they were dispersed. The brilliance of the Germans in 1939 and 1940 is they take their tanks that are dispersed and they bunch them together into divisions of tanks where you have hundreds of tanks just punching through a line, and the infantry's behind them. They're leaving the infantry way behind them, and they're just punching through, and they're taking these deep dives and dashes into enemy territory. That's one of the main reasons we're not going to have the same level of static trench warfare in World War II as we saw in World War I. Another big advantage is going to be the radio. If you remember in World War I, we had these big artillery guns, but it was really hard to aim them because the guns were way behind the lines. The guns couldn't see what they were firing at. So you had like carrier pigeons saying, you had a forward observer out there ducking his head above the trench and is watching these rounds hit, and maybe this round is trying to hit, I don't know, a fortification or something, maybe a machine gun emplacement. Got his eyes up and he's trying to see and says, oh, okay, those rounds are coming in 200 meters to the left and they need to go up another 100 meters. So then he gets a carrier pigeon out or a runner and writes, that adjustment, sends it back. Well, the adjustment doesn't happen for so long that the rounds just aren't effective. What's going to be different in World War II is the radio. So you're going to be able to have a forward observer who is looking at a target, looking at a machine gun with a radio going, okay, I see the round, left 50, up 200, left 50, up 100, fire for effect. And then they're going to be able to get the rounds in on these positions, and they're going to have really accurate artillery fire because of this. Of course, another major technological advancement is the airplane. Of course, we had the airplane in World War I, but these were primitive things. In the first days of World War I, the first planes weren't even armed. You just had a pilot that had a pistol. The first dogfights in the air were literally guys shooting pistols at each other. The first bombs were guys throwing grenades out of their airplanes. But by World War II, we've got planes that are going 400 or 500 miles per hour, planes that are carrying 500-pound bombs. We have dive bombing planes, which is, so if a plane's coming in like this, dropping bombs, it's not very accurate. back then it's not nearly as accurate because that's a lot more complicated of a calculation. But what the Germans are going to do really well, and we'll copy them, is have dive bombers that come straight down, point at the target, release that bomb, and then pull up at the last minute. And what that does is it makes your bombing really accurate. And so the Germans are able to use this in their blitzkrieg. So to punch holes through their enemies' lines, they've got fast-moving tanks, they've got highly accurate artillery, they've got dive bombers, and they're not going to use them in Poland. But after in Norway and in France, they're going to use paratroopers. Think about in World War I, they were just thinking, how can we get our troops over the lines? Well, in World War II, you're going to be able to fly them over the lines, and they're going to land via parachute and attack your enemy from the rear. So warfare has really changed by World War I. And one of the problems that Britain and France are going to face early on in the war is they're fighting the last war. You're going to see this with the French in a minute. They still think they're fighting World War I. They think the Germans are going to use the Schlieffen Plan, and it's not going to work out that way. Okay, so after Germany takes Poland, they do some random stuff up in Scandinavia we're not going to get into. But their next big target is going to be France, Belgium, Luxembourg. There's actually about eight to 10 months, I can't remember which one, between the invasion of Poland and the invasion of France. And you've got the French army just hunker down here, and the British come over the channel and join them. The Germans are going to call this the Sitzkrieg because nothing really happens. The Americans the Americans are going to call it the phony war because they're not fighting for 8 months. It's one of those great questions of history. What if Britain and France had pushed into Germany while the German army was out east? We don't know. But they don't. They sit there. And again, this is because the French especially are fighting the last war. They're still fighting World War I. And their whole strategy is defensive. They knew that Germany had more people than them. The French leaders said, we're just going to defend the homeland. We're not going to worry about going into Germany. So from 1928 on, the French construct what's called the Maginot Line. It's this very, very long, I mean, this is well over 100 miles, line of fortifications that is designed to keep the Germans out. Now, just looking at this map, you probably already see the big flaw in this plan, and the flaw is that the line ends right here. This was because the Low Countries here were also supposed to construct their own fortifications, but they didn't. They did not complete them in time. So France, they know this is going to be a problem. They know that these fortifications aren't done. So what the French and British do is they move into Belgium and they take up positions on rivers right here that are not on this map. So they have this continuous line, but they're going to leave one big weak spot in their line. Okay. Before we get to that weak spot, though, let's just look at the Maginot Line. So this is a cross section of the Maginot Line. Remember, over 100 miles long. And you can see the enemy would have approached from this direction. You can sort of see the bigger picture here. The enemy would have approached from this direction, and all through this, they're going through minefields, machine gun emplacements. They've got tank traps. That's a hole big enough for a tank to fall into and get stuck. And then when they get back here, they've got these crazy fortifications. All of this is underground. Remember, they're still fighting World War I in their minds. So they thought, man, what would have been the best case scenario for World War I? So they build these huge cities underground that have hospitals, water storage. They've got massive magazines for ammunition. They have barracks down here. Your troops can sleep in here. They've got kitchens. They've got rest facilities. And your entrance is all the way on the other side of the hill. They've got lookout towers with periscopes. They've got fire control towers. That tells the artillery rounds where to go. And then they've got these huge guns. They're going to shoot 10 or 20 miles out into enemy territory. These were serious fortifications. Problem is the Germans go around them. Awkward. Okay. So what happens is the Germans actually are planning on copying the Schlieffen plan from World War One. They're planning on coming straight through here and then moving south on Paris. But a German plane gets lost, it gets shot down, and the German plans are captured. So the British and French go, yes, we have the plans. We know exactly what they're going to do. The Germans go, they got our plans. Let's change our plans. So one German general pitches this idea to Hitler, and he loves it. What they decide to do is they decide to go through the Ardennes forest. This is a densely wooded area that's going to be important when we talk about the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. But the British and French just thought the Germans could never come through here. The tanks won't fit. The roads aren't good enough. Their tanks are going to get traffic jams. There's no way they come through here. And by the way, that's a similar thing that happens to Pearl Harbor, right? Oh, there's no way the Japanese could ever hit us out here this far in the Pacific. I think there's a military lesson there. But the Germans go right through this area that's barely defended. Huge surprise. And they're able to surround the British and French armies. They're able to come in and start attacking the Maginot Line from the other side. Again, awkward. This is my awkward turtle. Anyway, in 1940, France surrenders. Okay. A bunch of British troops get stuck at Dunkirk. A lot of them escape, through this huge naval lift effort. But things are not looking good in 1940. France has fallen, Belgium, Netherlands, all of that's fallen to Germany. Poland's fallen. And then it's Britain's turn. So if we look at the map here, the great fear is that right after this, the Nazis are going to cross the English Channel and invade Britain and take it over. Franklin FDR, he's really worried about this, just to bring in the American perspective, because if England falls, where is America? And he knows at this point America's going to have to fight. He hasn't told the American people he knows that yet. But he says, if Britain is taken, where is America going to even stage for this war? So anyway, what the Battle of Britain is it's an aerial war. The British had a very strong Air Force, the Royal Air Force, which they still have today. And Hitler knew he could not invade England until he ruled the air, because your troops are incredibly vulnerable on the ground. If German troops are landing on British beaches, they have to rule the air so that those troops aren't bombed on those beaches. Excuse me. So the Battle of Britain happens for much of 1940. And what it is it's the German planes flying over during the day and at night to bomb the British. Now, very early on in this, Hitler makes a huge mistake. So some German cities were bombed. He wanted to get the British back for that. So instead of focusing on British airfields or British factories for war production or military facilities, he starts bombing London and other major British cities. What this does is it makes the British people really angry. It gets them pumped up for war. It doesn't hurt Britain militarily. It's basically a huge waste of resources for the Germans. They lose a lot of planes. You can see a Spitfire here shooting down, I think, a Heinkel 111 German bomber. This was a crazy air war. You see Winston Churchill down here walking through London, having just been bombed. So this was a tough thing for the British people. They evacuated the children to the countryside. If you've read the Chronicles of Narnia, you know all about that. Careful of wardrobes. Another really interesting thing from this battle is the invention of radar. So the British are able to build, this is a brand new technology, they build all these radar towers across the coast of Britain. And that allows them to know when the Germans are coming, so they're able to shoot down a lot of German aircraft. What's really important about the Battle of Britain is that the Germans are checked. Okay, the Germans are stopped. They don't get to invade Britain. And then we end up with the situation where the threat of Britain being invaded is no longer there, because the English win the Battle of Britain, but still most of Europe is under Nazi sway. Okay. I said I was going to talk about Hitler's great mistake. Excuse me. Here it is. Operation Barbarossa. So in 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact. They agreed to split up Poland. This shocked the world. It's a big surprise. In 1941, Hitler decides to invade the Soviet Union. This is where he really shoots himself in the foot. Okay, he made it a two-front war, so that now he'd be fighting on at least two sides, just like in World War One. His generals thought this was a horrible mistake, but he really wanted. He hated the communists. He hated Stalin. He really wanted to take Russia. Um, he knew his history. He knew Napoleon had failed at this. He knew others had failed at this. And you should know from European history, Napoleon fails not because of Russian soldiers, but because of Russian frostbite. Okay. But he doesn't learn from it. He thinks that his tanks and he thinks that his maneuverability with vehicles is going to make him able to defeat the Russian winter. He's going to be sorely mistaken. So he launches the largest land invasion in history, and they've got three major army units, one going for Leningrad, one going for Moscow, and one going for Stalingrad. And they're going to get there. They're going to get all the way to these places, and then the Russian winter is going to set in. And the exact same thing that happened to Napoleon is going to happen to Hitler. So this is Hitler's great mistake. It's debatable if we would have beaten the Nazis had he not done this. So 90% of Germans who die in World War II are going to die on the Eastern Front. Okay. We Americans love to talk about D-Day, which, don't get me wrong, that's the largest naval invasion in history. That was an amazing feat. Our soldiers did great things in Europe. But we tend to think that those were the really big things of World War II. The big battle of World War II was fought in the Soviet Union. Okay. The scale of these tank-on-tank fights and soldier-on-soldier fights was just massive and ridiculous. And I don't know if the world will ever see it again. We'll get back to this. Hitler's great mistake. All right. So now the United States is getting ready to join the war. So let's just catch up on what the Japanese Empire has been doing. By the way, one thing I should have mentioned earlier is that Japan at this time is going to have its own sort of fascism. It's called state Shinto, and basically the Japanese state is going to be able to absolutely control the Japanese people. And this is why they're able to wage such a massive war here and elicit the kind of control over their citizens that they're able to do. They basically make the nation a religion to a certain extent. So we talked about the Japanese invading Manchuria in 37 and beyond. They go into China. They go into Vietnam. So the Japanese Empire has been expanding while, again, America has been struggling with the Great Depression. Remember, America has its own empire in the Pacific at this time, right here. The Philippines, we've got Guam. Of course, we've got Hawaii, which would be out here. So the U.S. has its own little empire, and Japan is getting ready to try to knock out the American fleet in the Pacific. Okay, so what is going on in the United States during all of this? So first of all, in 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt is running for an unprecedented third term. He decides to ignore George Washington's precedent of only running for 2 terms. He wants to go after that third term. He sees the war is coming and he thinks that he's the man to lead the United States during the war. And I don't know that he's wrong. Okay. I'm glad he was president during the war. The United States is still in the Great Depression in 1940 and in 1941. Despite the New Deal, the New Deal is going to raise American morale. It's going to preserve capitalism at the expense of socialism. but it's not going to bring America out of the Great Depression. World War II is going to do that. 15 million men are going to put on uniforms in World War II, and the factories are going to be at full capacity. That's what's going to end the Great Depression. So anyway, 1940, 1941, we're still in the Great Depression. FDR runs on an anti-war platform when he runs for president in 1940. Yet he's being dishonest here, okay? He knows that America is going to join this war. In fact, he wants America to join this war because he wants to protect Britain, and he fears a world that is controlled by the fascists, okay? He doesn't want America to be standing alone with no allies against the totalitarian fascist regimes. So, 1940, he says, I'm not going to send your boys into foreign wars. But in his mind, he's like, I'm going to send your boys into foreign wars. I just can't say that because if I say that, I probably won't get elected. Remember, America had retreated into isolationism in the interwar period, and that's where the American mind still is. We're isolationists. We don't want to deal with Europe and European problems. That said, in 1940, he passes the Selective Training and Service Act. This is our first peacetime draft, okay? So the writing is on the wall. We see this is coming. FDR is trying to get us prepared for it, but he's not ready to jump in yet. 1941, things aren't going well in the Soviet Union. At this point, we're starting to see the Soviet Union as an ally, even though they're communist, because they're fighting the Nazis. And we think the Nazis are the worst enemy. Britain's also in trouble with its economy, with its ability to produce war material. So in 1941, Congress passes and FDR signs the Lend-Lease Act. And this is important. What this does is it lets the president lend or lease war material to any country as long as he thinks it's in our national interest to do so. So we are going to use the Lend-Lease Act to arm the Allies, to arm Britain, to arm Free French, to arm the Soviet Union. When the Soviet soldiers push back westward across the Soviet Union and they're kicking Nazi butt, which they're going to do pretty soon here, they're going to do it in Dodge trucks and they're going to do it with American tanks. Not solely, but they're going to be using our stuff because of the Lend-Lease Act. Okay. The Atlantic Charter in 1941, Churchill and FDR get together and they write the Atlantic Charter. Think of this as Wilson's 14 points, okay? It's incredibly similar to the 14 points. What they're trying to do here is establish a paradigm or a model for what the world will look like after World War II. And this is one of the first stepping stones to the United Nations, okay? So a lot of the same things as the 14 points, like self-determination, restoring borders to the way things were, freedom of the seas, low economic barriers, okay? Let's see. 1941, U.S. public opinion is still against the war. FDR wants America in this war. He thinks it's necessary, but he can't ask for Congress to declare war until he has a casus belli, until he has a reason for war. So next time, he's going to get that reason. He's going to get it on December 7th, 1941. All right, guys, that's it for today. Don't get coronavirus.